On that note, I want to open this out to the audience. So we have an audience mic. Please wait for the mic because we're recording this for distribution. And I just want to go to this question, just gentleman here.
Hi, Bret. Tom, we met earlier briefly at the bar.
Hi, Tom.
I was just wondering, it resonated a lot what you said about, basically we're standing in our own way with the way that we're thinking and being kind of growth machines as we are, and just looking out to reproduce, and that's not helpful. I'm just thinking myself, I find it really, really hard to find that third way of thinking. So not being hopeful and not being fearful, because I think both might be kind of wrong, because actually I'm still standing in my own way. I have a physical body. I want to survive. I might even want to, just generate more babies and whatever. How do I get out of that way of thinking?
Well, again, that's going to be really a personal question, but at some level, I don't know. If I were to start with that question, I would say, well, here's the bad news. You are going to die, right? Could be sooner, could be later. But at some level, the clock is ticking. And I think culturally speaking, we in the West work very hard not to have to think about that. But if we tune into it and we realize that actually it has implications, and the question isn't how do I avoid dying, it's what do I do with the time I have left, you could get pretty excited about, the fact that the next few decades might be a time in which, it might be a time that people are still talking about 1,000 years from now, if there are people to do any talking at all. If there are, they might look back on this and say, yeah, that was a pretty close call for humanity, but aren't we glad that they bootstrapped these new mechanisms? So anyway, I would think that that's, I don't know if we do live in an era. I rather think if we don't live in an era in which we bootstrap the new mechanisms, then there won't be people here 1,000 years from now to talk about it. But if there are, then our having been here at this moment is kind of an honor, right? And it's also a really interesting set of puzzles to be faced with. So maybe if I were in your shoes, I would say getting excited about the puzzle might be the way to go.
Any other questions as well? Just here.
Hi, Bret.
Hi
Thank you for coming. Interesting talk. My name is Melania. We met before. Thinking about the rise in populism, from an evolutionary perspective, what is it about the populist discourse that is so effective?
Well, so let's talk about what happened in the U.S. in our last election, because I think it tells a very clear story, but it's one I haven't really heard said out loud. So we had two insurgencies. We had one on the political left with Bernie Sanders and one on the political right with Donald Trump. The Democrats took care of their insurgency. They got rid of it. That left one insurgency on the map. And what isn't said very frequently about what happened in the U.S. is that a large number of people, it was enough probably to sway the election, or at least to contribute substantially to Trump's victory, switched from Sanders to Trump, which is politically incoherent if you look at what these people represent. But if your real point was, I'm so frustrated with what this system is delivering that I'm going to vote against the system, and you can't vote against the system with Sanders in the general election because he's endorsed Clinton, so now you're going to vote against the system by voting for Donald Trump, that tells you really where we are in history, right? It is finally to the point where people are angry enough about the corruption and the dysfunction to confront the system. So I actually find that quite hopeful. On the other hand, what we didn't make any sense. So, and it's put us all in a substantial amount of danger. But I would say the key part of the thing to pay attention to is that frustration is still there, and harnessing it to a useful purpose would be a very wise thing to do.
Hello, my name is Daniel. So there's a great amount of fantastic intellectuals out there who we can reach through podcasts and YouTube. And there are a few topics that pops up every time. So like AI, global warming, the political problems. And the strange thing that each of these intellectuals think that education is extremely important, but probably this is the first time when I heard a few sentences about education. And what I want to ask is, why do you think it's not a topic out there talking about the reform of education, just like any other topics?
That's a really interesting question. I think there are a couple things going on. I know that while Heather and I were teaching at Evergreen, there was a certain lack of interest in talking about what might be wrong with the educational apparatus if you thought that the apparatus was itself quite broken. And there was a way in which it looked like it came down to the fact that people who were the product of that system weren't very interested in recognizing it as a failure, because to recognize it as a failure is to recognize themselves as not capable. So I don't have any problem recognizing that the system that produced me is falling short, but a lot of people do. So I think there's just an emotional bias against it. But I also think in some ways it's a mirror for the situation that we're in terms of governance, which is, so we have a metaphor that we use in evolutionary biology, which I find very useful. It's called the adaptive landscape. And basically, one needs to think about opportunities as peaks on the adaptive landscape and obstacles to getting to an opportunity as valleys. So you have to go from a low peak through a valley to get to a high peak. And the problem is that if you think about the height on the adaptive landscape as a measure of how good things are, well, if you're on a low peak and you have to go into the valley, things get worse before they get better. So what would you have to do to make the educational system work? Well, it's an awfully deep valley with a very beautiful peak on the other side that I think we can't quite see. So people, I think, are troubled by the gap. And that gap, if you can't imagine what's on the other side, then the gap looks very frightening. I mean, maybe it's just a bottomless pit. So we're in that same puzzle politically, because you have to abandon the idea that the policy proposals of the moment contain any sort of important solution before you can be free enough to start thinking about, well, how many systems are there that actually could solve our problems, and what might they look like, and what are the dangers if you set one in motion? So the size of the gap is actually, I think the way to say it is, there's an interaction between the Overton window, which is that which you are capable of conceptualizing, and the size of that gap. And if your Overton window isn't big enough to encompass what's on the other side, you shy away from that puzzle. So broadening the Overton window might be the way to get there, or properly painting a picture that has enough reality to it that people can begin to imagine, what's on the other side.
Thanks a lot, Bret. That was very interesting and a little unexpected, actually. So I want to bring in the issue of humor, and also precedents for thinking about our being in a sort of species-level existential risk. So going back to the Cold War, and I want to raise the specter of Herman Kahn, Dr. Strangelove, the model for Dr. Strangelove. And he had a certain kind of way, what he called, thinking the unthinkable. And so the idea was, and in a way it challenges something that you seem to assume in your talk, because when you talk about the existential risk facing humanity, you keep on using this word we, as if all of us are going to either survive or die. But as a matter of fact, it's more likely that given the kinds of existential risks that we're likely to face, that it'll take out a certain percentage of the human population, but not all of it. And it probably will take out a significant amount of the infrastructure and the culture and so forth that maintains the human population, but not all of it. And so the point then becomes, and this is where you start to think about the future, is what sorts of technologies and things, what sorts of cultural arrangements will you need, assuming that we will indeed end up having to go through a very deep valley, to use what your metaphor just now, right? In the sense that we are going to actually hit the bottom. We're going to have the existential risk, but it's not going to take out everyone. It'll take out maybe 30%, 40%, maybe 70%. But let's say there's still 30% around, and let's say the planet is not totally destroyed, and you pick your catastrophe, okay? They were talking about nuclear exchange, of course, but we have a lot of catastrophes to choose from these days. And so part of this in the Cold War motivated a lot of, as it were, after doomsday technologies, one of which was the internet, right? Because the internet was created on the assumption that if there was a nuclear exchange, the telephone lines would be taken out and you'd need some other way of mass communication. Now, of course, we never had this kind of mutual nuclear exchange that would end the world in that kind of fashion. But nevertheless, we benefited from the technology as a result once the Cold War was over. So from the standpoint of rationality, right now, right? Is there not something to be said for this strategy that I've just laid out for you?
Yeah. So a couple things. One, there is I don't know that it has a name, but there is a process whereby something that has brought you to a certain place becomes an existential threat to you. And so these are things we're very poorly prepared for, because the very thing that has worked to get us here is now the thing we must get over without discovering it as an existential failure. I think this is where we are. So I can't say for sure that we couldn't have a major collapse that would wipe out some large fraction of the population of the globe and leave some other fraction. But I also have the sense that that is, in a way, a fairy tale that serves a certain mode that used to work. So there's a way in which populations collapsing leaves more well-being for those who are left behind. So if you are in a position to survive a collapse better than somebody else, you may actually want it, because it sort of purges some fraction of the population whose wealth or opportunity you can then take advantage of. So it's a kind of cryptic transfer. And I'm afraid that that game has worked so well so many times that we are now dealing with people who are triggered to think, we are there again, whether they know consciously that that's what they're thinking or not. But when I look at the, one struggles for words, but I mean the perfectly insane way that we've hooked up the 400 civilian nuclear reactors that exist on the planet, so that they require absolutely constant vigilance to keep not only the cores of the reactors cool, but these vast fuel pools, right? We have behaved so stupidly, and the amount of money that it would take to just reduce that problem to a third of its present size is small, and yet we don't do it. So I know we're lying to ourselves. You could make the same argument relative to Carrington events and the vulnerability of our transformers to a solar storm, right? It would cost apparently something like the price of a single B-2 bomber to fix the entire North American grid and make it immune to a Carrington event. So in essence, so little money that nobody needs to suffer any sort of privation of any kind in order to address it. And yet we endure some large risk every decade that a storm is going to come out of nowhere and knock out half the grid of North America and leave it offline for 6 months with who knows how many nuclear reactors suddenly dependent on the constant delivery of diesel fuel. So I can tell we're behaving stupidly because there are problems that would be very cheap to solve that are very, very dangerous that we don't solve. All of those reactors spilling their contents at once would be very bad. Is it impossible for humans to survive that? I don't know, but it would make a much lesser world. So I know anybody who's playing this strategy because they think they're going to inherit the world with fewer people on it is making an error, because the world they're going to inherit isn't going to be a very nice place. So I would say whether or not existential threat is really all of us, the way I think it is, or it isn't really all of us, but the world will be toxified in a way that it won't be detoxified for hundreds of thousands of years, it makes sense for us to behave as a united entity that faces a bottleneck that we have to get through together or not at all.
There's something about New Zealand that everybody knows about that some of us don't.
Yeah.
Perhaps as well. There's very few nuclear reactors. Hopefully your brother might know something about that. Pat Kane.
Hi, Pat Kane from FutureFest. I want to ask you a question about epistemic diversity. Lock the doors. The Chinese leadership described themselves as wanting to bring about an ecological civilization. That's their stated aim. They're invoking Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism, and they're building a social rating system out of algorithms in the internet so that people can get themselves in balance with each other, i.e. reduce their desirous egotism and fit themselves to the social bond. You know, mindfulness is raging across the West as a way for us to deal with our Cartesian dualism, non-dualism versus, funny enough, versus dualism. To what extent is your evolutionary framework actually a very Western defined evolutionary framework? You're dealing with the kind of the polarization of the opposites, as maybe Jordan Peterson would talk about. And isn't there a question of epistemic diversity? Isn't one of the things about being evolutionarily human is that we are creative, but the extent of our creativity is that we can actually define epistemology and ontology, truth and reality, in wildly different ways? And aren't you coming from quite a narrow Western position?
Yes and no. You know, my way of thinking comes at the end of a trajectory, right? So Darwin had to do what he did in order for the people in the generation ahead of me to learn what they did about evolution in order for me to go where I've gone with it. But at the end of the day, all true models of the universe must reconcile. So I can't say how my viewpoint would be different if it had arisen in, an Eastern tradition. What I can say is it's either wrong or it will reconcile with whatever would come about through that alternative path. And so I'm not too worried about it, right? In other words, the reason that I believe what I believe is that the model makes predictions, and those predictions match what I see in the world. And if the model was way off, that wouldn't be the case. So what I would love is to discover that you're right and that this trajectory exists in other traditions. And I would like to see those traditions emerge and then compare notes, because no doubt there are biases in the form of emphasis. There are things that, I find central that may be underemphasized in another version. And likewise, there would be things from some other version of this story that I don't see as important enough. So I would love to compare notes with other people who had reached parallel conclusions, or if they'd reached conclusions that were inconsistent with what I think is true. I'd love to hear about that too, because either I'm right and I've got some teaching to do, or I'm wrong and I've got some learning to do, but either way, it's productive. So anyway, I'm looking forward to finding those other modes, but in the meantime, I'm not going to worry too much that it's wrong because it doesn't come from some other tradition. I've got the tools I've got, and they've led me where I am.
Two more questions. Just here, Guinness Taylor. Hello.
Hey, Luke, thanks. Hi, Bret. My
Hi
name's
there.
Ganesh. I have a really quick question for you. So it seems to me that what you're describing is that you want humans to have a conversation about what our purpose is as humankind, right? I'm a human being, I'm an individual, and I'm asking myself that question just in my own head, right? And I don't quite know how long that's going to take me to find an answer beyond I need to reproduce. So my question is really simple. If it might take me some time to do that, how long do you think it's going to take for all of us to have those conversations with ourselves and then with other people?
A good and very subtle point. But I would argue that one of the things that we do not properly appreciate about the very unique sort of creature that we are is that we do an awful lot of thinking in our heads. To each of us, self is a very compelling entity because we have contact with it in a way we don't have contact even with people who we're very close with who don't happen to be self. On the other hand, much of what we understand about what is true, we generate in dialogue with other people that share enough with us for their thoughts to be provocative to us and our thoughts to be provocative to them. So I really am literally talking about us talking to each other about useful purpose. And I will say, having done this now with many rooms full of students, I think the conversation is more straightforward than I think you think. In other words, there aren't that many purposes that can be defended. And once you get in the neighborhood of those purposes that can be defended, it's really a question of precision beyond what we need. Because really what we need is a mechanism to get us through the bottleneck, to figure out how to stabilize the way we interact so that we're not constantly generating new threats to humanity. And having done that, it leaves people free to disagree about abstractions like, well, what is our purpose?
Time for one more question just here.
Hi, Bret. I'm Lucy. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I was more interested in going back to a point that you touched on about comedy and the actual ability to even have these conversations in an open, free-thinking way. There's been a lot of talk, or I've read quite a few articles saying that what happened to you and your wife at Evergreen was sort of an outlier. And I was wondering if you could expand on, even if it was an outlier in its sort of severity and extremity, how much of it is it a symptom of a much larger problem on campuses in the US? And as a follow-up, I was wondering if you have any knowledge of what it's like elsewhere. Have any UK academics reached out to you? And if so, what have they been telling you about what it's like here?
Yeah, that's an interesting set of questions. I do think Evergreen was an outlier in one sense. I mean, it was, I don't know whether this audience saw what took place, but it was spectacular and absurd in a way that's going to be hard for anybody to top for a little while. It's going to take some creativity. On the other hand, it was a version of something that is utterly generic. So Heather and I have been involved in many conversations since last May about the state of the world and what to do about it. And it is actually rare to have a conference where you don't have some version of this show itself, often incoherently in the context of what's being discussed. So yes, there is at the moment, I find it a rather absurd hunger to hear that the problem is really much smaller than people think. And yes, there are excesses, and we've seen them on YouTube, but no, it's not threatening the academy. Yes, it is threatening the academy. It is like a social lobotomy, right? The concepts that people just cannot entertain are so many that basically it hobbles the thinking of the entity itself. And on the one hand, I find it very odd to be in the position of defending the academy, because when I was employed within the academy, I was not a fan of how it functioned. On the other hand, I now find the idea that we are going to confront Enlightenment values of all things absurd. And even, it's not even Enlightenment values. They're literally confronting the idea of enlightenment. They're challenging it with the notion that there is only power and there is not truth. And therefore, all arguments that claim to have detected some truth are really cryptic arguments designed to wield power. That's such a dangerous kind of sophistry that we have to get over it, right? And we have to show students how to get over it so that they are not detained for their entire lives with this wrong way of seeing things. I think what's going on in the UK, if I understand it correctly, is not as severe as what's going on in the US, but the way we're all linked together, right? The academy isn't a bunch of, it's not even really a bunch of different schools. The schools are linked together through disciplines, right? It's linked together through publications. And those linkages mean that to the extent that some set of concepts becomes forbidden in some quadrant, that spreads in some way the rest of us can't detect. But the problem really couldn't be more dangerous from the point of view of the threat it represents to the academy But by virtue of the role that the academy is supposed to play in civilization, it's actually, if all we lost was the academy, I think that would be a win. We can rebuild the academy. But what we can't afford to do is descend into madness for the next 20 years because it's become fashionable to think there's no such thing as reality. We have to confront that and properly disarm it so that we can get back to the difficult business of figuring out what's true and what to do about it.
And Bret, I think my final question is a follow-on from that. We've seen the new atheists, and I'd argue that people like yourself and people like Jordan Peterson fall into a new category who's dealing with the fact that God is dead, which are the new progressives. And people like yourself who are evolutionary biologists who understand certain scientific facts about the ways in which humans operate and then have to come into conflict with folks who argue identity politics, who hold sometimes rather mythic notions of identity. And really my closing question is, how do we as individuals and how do you be an effective progressive in the 21st century? What does it mean to be a new progressive?
So the distinction that I'm going to draw might be a little hard for people to follow, but there are cryptically among us two sorts of folks. Because of the way well-being is acquired in life, it is perfectly possible to be dead wrong about the nature of the universe and do well within it, because of the role that the social architecture plays in allocating rewards. So the problem is that being dead wrong and getting ahead by being dead wrong causes wrong ideas to appear quite right. What is going on with the new voices that I think you are correctly defining them as progressive, even though some of them are right of center. Those new progressive voices seem, without exception, to be people who are operating from first principles. And the hallmark of a first principles thinker is that they are unpersuaded by a mob, right? It doesn't matter that you're the only person in the room that believes something to be true. That is immaterial with respect to whether it actually is true. And so fundamental thinkers are being actually identified and targeted by this illiberal movement, in part because they are the people who will be unpersuaded by threat. So what I would argue is that all of us need to tap into this distinction, and we need to start following first principles where they lead, even when they lead us to frightening conclusions, right? That's the part that's difficult for people, is that there's no guarantee if you do follow first principles that you will find out that everything's going to be okay, because maybe it won't. But the only hope we have of fixing the problems that we face is to confront what they actually are and to be careful in our critical thinking about what causes them and what other routes are available to us. So in essence, we just don't have any choice. First principles are where it's at, and you're either a first principles thinker or we need to be careful about what you're trying to